First of all, I'll leave it to you to introduce yourself, your role, and essentially the first big macro question will be for you to help us to frame Aragon and the ecosystem of Aragon and the story maybe also that took you guys here, and I would say also the vision that you have.
Sure. Should I just start? Are you recording? Cool. So my name is Luke. I do product at Aragon One, which is one of the teams kind of working on the Aragon project. I joined the team about 2 years ago. I was really excited by the potential for decentralized autonomous organizations as this like concept of a way to use blockchains and distributed technology to set like in-code sort of rules that everybody can follow and coordinate, and use that to solve like large-scale coordination challenges. Aragon as a project has built a ton of infrastructure to support those types of things. So we've started by creating a smart contract development framework on the Ethereum blockchain that allows for these types of like systems to be kind of encoded. We've got modules for voting. We've got modules for like creating and issuing tokens. And this kind of library of modules has grown and kind of expanded over the years. And so there's over 1,400 organizations live on kind of mainnet today of various like sizes and structures. But the earliest ones are pretty simple. And then some of the newer ones are a little bit more like complex systems, and they get a little bit more interesting. The vision for the Aragon project as a whole is to create a kind of digital jurisdiction for digital organizations. So looking at kind of new ways for people to coordinate online and create value online, and how those things kind of network together. It's a pretty grand vision. I think we're making like strides in the right direction, but it'll definitely be a many years journey.
Thank you. Can you say a couple of more words on the ecosystem? No? So to help us understand better, for example, when you said Aragon One is one of the teams. Also, if you can say, explain us a little bit more the stakeholders, how they interact. Just to give us a broader understanding of what is the system around Aragon.
Sure. Yeah. So Aragon, when it started, there was a crowd sale where people contributed. They got an Aragon network token, which is going to be used as the kind of DAO token that like controls an entity that we call the Aragon network, and that is something that we're kind of working to deploy. It has a couple of kind of components that were outlined. There's this Aragon court, which is a dispute resolution mechanism, and people can stake ANT to participate in that dispute resolution like protocol. But we also have some traditional legal entities that interact kind of in the ecosystem. So there's the Aragon Association, which is a nonprofit Swiss association. It manages sort of the treasury of funds that were raised in the initial crowd sale. The Aragon One team, which I'm a part of, is like a for-profit Swiss company that does development work within the ecosystem, has been kind of responsible for developing the smart contract framework that I was talking about. It hosts some of the infrastructure that people are using. And is continuing to kind of work on various projects, including like the development of the court protocol, which we launched recently, and we're currently working on other aspects there. In the past, there's been grants that have been given out to other teams in this space as well to work on various other things, including like some of the modules that I was talking about earlier. One of them I actually also participate in, which is OneHive. OneHive started as kind of like a community organization that started working on things just because they wanted to build a DAO, and I participated in that. The current like focus for that team is on creating like bonding curve based organizations, kind of inspired by the Common Stack. If you're familiar with that team as well, so they're working on conviction voting and kind of a marketplace app. But the interesting thing is that you get like a lot of people contributing various different ways, because everything in the Aragon ecosystem is completely open source. So we've had instances where a team has worked on like one module, and then another team has picked it up and forked it and like made some changes and tweaked it. It's cool to see that type of interaction where you've got different teams and different groups interacting on the edges around kind of a core idea.
Sorry, I don't know why the space bar doesn't work. So my question, quick question on Aragon One, is some kind of institutional team, or it's one of the many teams? I understand that there are teams that grow more organically and some others that are more institutional, right? By institutional, I mean maybe connected with the association.
Yeah, the Aragon One team is sort of like the first team. It was kind of like the actually, when I was originally hired, there wasn't like a split between the nonprofit association and like kind of what we call Aragon One now. That was something that like a year and a half or so ago was kind of a division that was created so that you could have kind of the nonprofit managing the treasury and then the actual like execution done by like a kind of more traditional team. There's still really close relationships there, for better or worse. The executive board of the Aragon Association is still heavily involved with the Aragon One team. So it's a very tight relationship still. But setting up that structure, the intention is to make it easier to kind of interact with the ecosystem. By kind of separating those roles.
Got it. First question that I would like to ask, since we want to understand how the idea of platforms also plays out through these new types of organizations that we are witnessing. So first question would be, do you see any marketplace dynamic that happens on top of Aragon? I mean, for example, connecting producers of value and consumers of value. I can think of, experts with, founders, or other kind of marketplace dynamics that connect people that to some extent are more able to achieve their objectives through Aragon facilitating and reducing transaction costs.
Yeah, I think the marketplace dynamics are actually a really, really important aspect to what we're doing at Aragon and kind of the larger concept of a DAO as this like decentralized autonomous organization. I think the important piece for a DAO to kind of work is that it has sort of an internal economy of some sort. So you've got like an economic game sort of at the core that people interact with. And when you have an economic game, often you end up with some sort of like internal capital or asset that can be traded on some sort of market. So if we look at things like Bitcoin or Ethereum, or even things like Uniswap, you end up with a set of rules or a protocol. People engage with that, and they are compensated in some sort of like asset or token, whether that's Bitcoin, Ethereum. In the case of Uniswap, it's like localized to specific pools, and you get this like liquidity token. Those things can be traded and exchanged. They have like a value associated with them. And if the system or DAO is working well, then the contributions people are making to the system are kind of well compensated. And then those you get sort of a market dynamic out of that.
And the compensation that they get is set by the the platform, or to some extent they are trading services between each other and the price, and they set the price between each other? How does it work? You know, just maybe some specifics.
Yeah, so it really depends on the mechanism. One of the most interesting mechanisms that I've seen is this combination of a bonding curve and conviction voting. This is the thing that I was mentioning when I was working on. But the bonding curve acts as an automated market maker. You insert some sort of like capital asset, and it'll like mint a like local token for you. And in this context, you combine that with conviction voting. Conviction voting allows you to submit proposals for like requesting funds. So like if somebody says, I want to go do X thing, I think it's valuable to the community or the project, they can put their own price on it because they're submitting a proposal. But then the entire like collective, everybody holding the token, can signal for the proposals that they find valuable. And the mechanism itself, the internal like mechanics, actually determines the like threshold of signal that needs to be staked to that particular proposal in order for it to be executed. So like if you are participating as somebody that's creating a proposal, you're kind of setting a price, but you have this market dynamic because you're not like a price taker. You have to get sufficient support from the community. And it's not like traditional voting where you're like, I submit a proposal and there's like a majority consensus that it gets approved. That isn't really a market-based mechanism. But in the case of conviction voting, you can buy tokens along this bonding curve to increase kind of influence. But as you do, you're like filling up this this funding pool or the common pool. And the level of support that or influence you have over proposals increases. So it's never like majority consensus, but like the more you contribute in terms of like economic capital into the system, the more influence you have on that economic capital leaving the system to compensate like for labor contributions. And so it's like serving the same purpose as like kind of voting on different kind of allocations in terms of judging labor, but it's a continuous process that's much more like kind of market driven because you have that like automated market maker determining the like kind of price of influence on the system.
I get it. So is it more for, I would say, can we describe it as a labor market to some extent that is focused on creating one-off contributions?
Yeah, I think that would be fair. It's definitely some sort of labor market, but the trick with these things is that you have these different components, like you have the bonding curve and you have conviction voting, but the actual like full system and kind of the relationship between the different stakeholders ends up like creating different dynamics. So if I just have a bonding curve, and one of the interesting things I've seen done with bonding curves recently is this idea of personal tokens. If you guys are familiar, basically they've taken the concept of a bonding curve and they have like a single issuer. So like I could issue my own token, call it the Luke token, and I can put it out into the market and I can accept that token for my services like I would a currency. And the trick that they've done is the issuer has a special permission to return the token back to the pool and reclaim some additional assets. And so like somebody can speculate, buy and sell the Luke token on external markets, but it'll always be slightly more valuable to me than to other people. And therefore I have kind of this incentive to exchange my labor for this specific token. In the case of conviction voting, we have kind of a similar sort of mechanism where the interactions with the bonding curve fill up this this kind of funding pool, which allows the like collective to allocate more capital to labor over time, and it creates kind of this system that self-balances. So it's important to look at not just like the specific mechanisms, but how they're composed and how people interact with them. So I think in that particular context, both of those examples, the personal token example and the like conviction voting plus bonding curve example, are labor markets, but they have different like interaction dynamics in terms of like how people participate in the system.
So to some extent, I would say to potentially give more details to listeners or viewers, the effect of this bonding curve is to some extent favor the early investors in successful projects and attract more support over time, as otherwise price of the tokens increases, so people are more incentivized to try to identify the projects they want to support and the labor that they want to support early in the process, right? Or to give trust, I would say.
Yeah, definitely. There is sort of like, the way that I like to think about bonding curves is as sort of a boundary mechanism. So if you're kind of thinking of a community or an organization, there's always going to be a lot of work that needs to be done to get things started. And there needs to be some sort of like way for you to balance the like initial like effort and capital in terms of like cultivating a great idea and executing on a great idea, while allowing people to kind of join in after the fact. And so like a really interesting example of this, if you are familiar with Reddit as like a social media platform, anybody can create a subreddit, and when it's there, it's like a blank canvas. You have to have like an idea, you have to like submit content, you have to like cross-post it to other things. There's a lot of like work that goes into creating the culture and the norms and the like interactions that make a subreddit an interesting place to hang out. But they also have this concept of brigading, where like a subreddit starts to get popular, and everybody's like vote on Reddit is equal. If you come into a subreddit from a different subreddit or as a different user of the platform, you've got just as much influence on this community as anybody else. And so as subreddits grow, they don't really have like a boundary mechanism where the people that like have created this community, they've cultivated this culture, have more influence in it than somebody who's just come in later as the subreddit's gotten popular. And so there's this kind of cultural like challenge where you're like, we want to have open and inclusive communities that anybody can join, but we also want to ensure that we are incentivizing people to like contribute early on when these things are not necessarily as rich or as valuable or as established. And so I think bonding curves as sort of a mechanism help us to address that problem, where we can have like a programmatic, predictable way to create that kind of boundary that rewards early contributors, but still enables us to fluidly onboard contributors down the line. So like if you compare this to a kind of more fixed mechanism where you're like the community starts and it's 5 people and they basically have to vote every person in, it's very permissioned. It's difficult for that to scale. And so like having something like a bonding curve gives you like a middle ground between being completely open and not having the right incentives, and being completely closed. And you can parameterize it like in different ways to like get more open or more closed.
Super. Thanks for the explanation. I think our listeners will enjoy. And you guys, if you want to ask questions, just raise your hand or jump in. So what would you define the common protocol or language of Aragon? I know, for example, you mentioned the tokens, but you also mentioned this idea of a bonding curve and the voting system as modules or elements. So I'm really interested in understanding if there is some kind of language that you need to understand or protocol that you need to accept to be able to interact in the system.
Yeah, I guess there's different layers in terms of who we're talking to. From a developer perspective, Aragon, the like smart contract framework and the toolkit it's based in Solidity on the back end, so to run on Ethereum or EVM compatible chains. And there is a front-end framework that is mostly in React that's used to kind of interact with the smart contracts and create interfaces. There's flexibility in the sense that like the smart contracts exist and you could actually use any kind of front-end language to interact with them. But that's very much on the developer side. On the user side, you're going to have an interface, and that's something that like we provide like this basic interface in terms of the Aragon client that most of the like modules when we talk about like apps have been designed to be compatible with. So you can open a DAO and you'll see a friendly kind of interface, and you can tie these things together. And if I go visit one Aragon organization, it may be configured differently, but the interface will be relatively similar. But we're actually more recently moving in a direction where we want to enable developers to actually create completely custom interfaces. What we found is that on the DAO side, if you're building like a community or a protocol or a decentralized application and you want to turn it into a DAO, you want your users to actually interact with the DAO elements and the protocol elements kind of within the context of the thing that they're interacting with. So like some of the people that have started using Aragon are decentralized applications and protocols. One of the most interesting ones in this context is Decentraland. They're building a digital VR world space. They have like this concept of digital land that is scarce that people can purchase, and then they can develop like content for that piece of land in like a virtual reality world. And the platform itself is sort of governed by a DAO, and you can go into the Aragon interface and you can see all of the governance decisions. It governs the like land contract that that all of these spaces kind of connect to. But from their perspective, it would make a lot of sense for them to like go into Decentraland and be able to interact with those contracts. They wouldn't necessarily want to use the Aragon interface as the primary way that people interact with the DAO. So we're actually trying to make it much easier for people to actually embed the Aragon like infrastructure and components and stuff into their own like app experiences. So that's something that's been relatively recent kind of development. Prior to that, we were kind of expecting everything to be exposed within the client. I don't know if that fully answered your question, if that was helpful, but
yeah. I mean, I'm thinking of what is your who are the entities in your ecosystem, no? And so I'm thinking about organizational developers, governance developers, let's say, more than actual independent contributors, and they are maybe connected with their contributors. So I understand that essentially the idea is to reduce the barriers for people to develop a complex governance processes in a simple and transparent way for their organizations to some extent.
Yeah, that's correct. So
I would say maybe we can extend the question more into what are the barriers that you see reduced by Aragon, more specifically.
Yeah, so I definitely think that there's a huge like infrastructure barrier in the sense that like writing complex smart contract code for blockchains is expensive and difficult. And so the way that we've structured things allows for reusable components to be like connected together in different ways. And so you're using the same code that's already been kind of audited and battle tested, and you're configuring it as opposed to deploying it yourself. And so I think that's a really strong value proposition. The other kind of piece that I think is really important that we're just sort of starting to get to that point. I talked earlier about kind of the court as this dispute resolution mechanism, and that's something that like has sort of launched in beta, but not completely launched, and it's not really available for typical users. But I think is going to be really, really important from the perspective of these new organizations that are aiming to be sufficiently decentralized. So there's this concept, and it's sort of an emerging legal concept. The term was kind of framed around the SEC's like analysis around Ethereum and Bitcoin as these things that have become sufficiently decentralized that it doesn't really make any sense for them to be deemed securities. There isn't really information asymmetry. There's enough participants in the ecosystem. There's like a fair set of rules that they're sufficiently decentralized. That typical like treatment of this as like an organization or a company doesn't make sense. And so in the context of Aragon and DAOs, we want to enable those types of organizations that aren't like companies, but sort of the fabric between companies. So if we look at like things like Ethereum or Bitcoin, you have lots of legal entities on the edges interacting and driving that forward. If we look at Aragon, we want to create these like large open communities where anybody can kind of participate by interacting with a bonding curve. They get some stake. They can interact. But if you have a public community like that, you need to solve for moderation and dispute resolution, because if you just rely on like a majority vote, you have no protection for like minority interests or minority stakeholders. And so the court allows us to have a decentralized solution for dispute resolution, so that you can have these types of organizations incorporate like moderation best practices, encode kind of the original intent in like human readable terms, augment the hard code in terms of smart contracts with softer sort of like moderation policies. And so we kind of started by making the smart contract side of things easier for organizations to kind of build these systems. And with the court, we're making it easier to take those systems and augment them with kind of moderation capabilities while retaining that like ability to kind of be sufficiently decentralized. Because if you're not sufficiently decentralized in these types of situations, you have a whole other set of kind of problems and challenges, and being on a blockchain makes a little bit less sense.
Mm-hmm. Can you expand a little in when you spoke about this idea of the space between organizations?
Yeah. So the concept of a DAO that I think like people use the word DAO all the time for a lot of different things, from like any organization that kind of has smart contracts as encoding their logic to things that look more like protocols, like Uniswap or Ethereum. I think that the key kind of characteristic of a DAO, and maybe this is a subset of DAOs in terms of how people are using the language, is that you have automation at the center, and humans and legal entities and companies at the edges. And so like if I look at something and the structure is you have like a specific legal entity, whether that's like an association or what have you, that has like authority at kind of the center, it's administering this thing. You have a model that looks like a company interacting with another company, or a company interacting with an association. But if you look at things like that are much more protocol-like, they have like automation, and they've got like an economic game that people are just kind of engaging with. You don't have the like legal entity as the thing that's kind of coordinating all these things. You have like a protocol that's coordinating a bunch of things at the edges. And I think the really powerful concept here is that you can scale positive sum interactions between like people and companies around a common like cause better if the kind of common cause and like those interactions are not are more automated and they're more like a protocol for coordinating and interacting, and you push the like specific agent issues to the edges. That's sort of what I mean.
Yeah, got it. So the idea is that as you have some kind of middle layer that connects different entities, and this middle layer is more transparent, more clear, more specified, I would say it's easier to trust this common layer, and therefore the organizations can dedicate themselves to what they're trying to do, and then let's say that if you have a sufficient evolutive middle layer that can put everybody on the same page and that everybody can trust, they can really act as a whole system, let's say, or according to the roots of the whole system. So maybe this is also something that lets me to connect with this idea of the governance models. So I'm interested to understand, how do you evolve these layers of coordination, and starting by maybe the one that you have been trying for Aragon. So what is the relationship that you see, for example, in the governance model of Aragon and the governance models that are emerging in terms of the places where Aragon technology is being implemented to orchestrate and facilitate whole systems?
Yeah. So we haven't launched the Aragon Network DAO officially. We kind of saw the court as a key dependency there, and so we started this process about a year and a half ago, a kind of community governance process where we allowed the Aragon token holders to basically make proposals and signal on proposals, but the Aragon Association was actually like managing the treasury and kind of executing things. So this is sort of like a soft kind of way to involve the community in setting priorities and directions. And we ran that for like 4 quarters, and then eventually earlier this year we sunsetted that process. And the reason we did that was because we found that there was a lot of kind of overhead in terms of that governance process. We learned a lot that having proposals and reaching kind of broad consensus didn't scale very well. So what we observed was that like people could engage in the process, but there wasn't enough kind of scrutiny and review happening of different proposals. The actual like voting participation rate, especially after kind of the initial phase, was actually relatively low. And so we kind of learned from that experiment, and we're looking to kind of launch a more governance minimized version of the Aragon network. And I think this is really key when we start to think about the idea of automation kind of at the center and humans at the edges. When we want like an institution essentially to help coordinate lots of individual actors, we want it to be stable and predictable and not really have a ton of discretionary authority. And so what that system looks like is pretty different than the process that we've been using. It probably will rely on a fund allocation mechanism closer to conviction voting. It'll probably have like a built-in kind of budget and make the process like simpler. It was a relatively like complex process where you had to kind of go through specific kind of voting periods. You have to kind of submit, get reviewed, and then go to a vote. What we're looking at will be much more kind of continuous and kind of self-regulating without nearly as much oversight. And so like that will combine kind of, it'll rely on the court to basically have like a clear set of like vision and like constraints in terms of like what's allowed. Like we don't want proposals that like are completely like outside of the bounds of the values of the project we want or the norms. But we also want to kind of leave it relatively unrestricted. We don't want to have like a review process or like an administrative process. We want proposals to be executed automatically. So I'm actually really excited about that. I can't share too much about kind of that next phase because we're still working on it. But it's very exciting.
Are you familiar, I guess, with just the golden idea of this progressive decentralization, right?
Progressive decentralization.
So this idea that you start from a more entrepreneurial approach, and then within time you decentralize the governance, no? Essentially, because what you just said, maybe at the start you need more coherence, and then within time you can evolve towards something more organically decentralized, let's say. So that was my comment. How do you see that playing out? So, for example, the experience that you have with the governance of Aragon, do you see that as a pattern that is playing out also in the organizations that are using Aragon technology to build their own path towards decentralization? Or it's more like, initially the start fully decentralized. So I see this pattern of, some entrepreneurs coming up with a new idea and then within time, transitioning this into the community to some extent in this process of making a commons out of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it makes a lot of sense. I'm not sure if there's I feel like there's quite a bit of context in terms of the pattern. So like I see this a lot in like DeFi applications right now where it's really, really important to move quickly and ship things. But it's also really dangerous to not have like a centralized off switch. So like if a bug or a vulnerability is found, you want people to be able to privately disclose that and take action. And there's kind of an inherent tension within the space because if you do have that like on-off switch and it's held by like a central party, you minimize some of the advantage that you get from kind of having this on a decentralized like financial stack in the first place. And you pay a lot for that in terms of UX and in terms of cost, like every interaction on like a shared infrastructure layer, like a blockchain, costs. So you have like these significant trade-offs. And if you start in a more centralized way, you in some cases you lose a lot of that advantage. And so like I think that it's incredibly prudent to be able to do like incremental decentralization because starting with a completely decentralized process is really hard and it may not work. And we need better kind of patterns to like make that easier. That you can kind of just copy and paste. But in the short term, starting out centralized and progressively decentralizing seems like the natural path. It just kind of has its own trade-offs as well.
Very interesting. I mean, it's very interesting because, and this is more an opinion, so then I will be back to questions. But it's very interesting because, for example, we had the chance to watch a video with Stina that we also mentioned in our newsletter a few weeks ago from, I think it was one of the CTO of Signal, if I'm wrong. And it was exactly talking about the issue with decentralized architectures in terms of controlling and controlling change and most importantly, evolution. So he basically was making the case that a centralized organization is it's faster to evolve, let's say, it's faster to adapt, it's more secure to some extent. than a fully decentralized one. And so, you know, my reflection is that maybe this idea of DAOs and generally decentralized organization is much more about reducing transaction costs, enabling everybody to contribute. So it's more about the transactional aspect and the value creation aspect than the governance. So, you know, paradoxically, let's say, you know, because the pressure for decentralization kind of was born out of friction in terms of feeling too much centralized governance. And at the end of the day, we may be realizing that it's much more about creating shared rules and transparency for contribution than actually overcoming centralized governance, which is to some extent useful in most of the phases of a process. Maybe we can think about fully decentralized systems when they reach really the commodity evolutionary stage, like the utility stage. But, you know, especially at the start and when the space is very evolutionary, maybe that's not the case.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think that in many ways, we actually want to try and do governance minimization if we want to scale decentralized systems, and finding ways where we can minimize the governance like changes as necessary is important. It's just there's certain types of changes, like if you want to support upgrades that like you really can't get around not having governance over them. So like we have to find kind of the right balance there, and whether that can be delegated to like a centralized party or safely delegated. So like one of the interesting kind of approaches that I've seen is that you give a centralized authority the ability to kind of pause or stop or like hit the big red button that says, hey, there's an emergency, and then that gives you time for your like slower decentralized governance process to like react. But there's definitely a tension between those two forces.
And also good, your point is very good in terms of also noting down that this kind of rule-based, transparency-based decentralization and governance, it's really about also innovation. So it's about really delegating the capability to transform and change and update the system at the edge, more than the idea that everybody needs to have a say on whatever happens. Maybe it's the other way around. It's really about trying to not make it the case that everybody needs to have a say about whatever is happening, because you want to have a more organic process of incorporating innovations from the edge of the system. And for that, you need transparency, a reduction of transaction cost, and a reasonably fast governance process.
Yeah, and I think that you need to you need the process to kind of adapt to the level of changes. And I think like when it comes to like fund allocation, it becomes a little bit easier because it's not like a discrete change. Whereas like if you're talking about an upgrade or responding to like a security vulnerability, that's always going to be a discrete change. So when it comes to like fund allocation, I can say, well, if you're only requesting 1% of the treasury, we don't need majority consensus to approve that. We can take a much smaller subset and we can move kind of quickly and kind of act on the principle of optimistic allocation, in the sense that like we can go in many different directions and kind of see where that gets us. But where there's like logical centralization in the system, like there's a certain set of contracts that that like make up the protocol, and we need to be able to upgrade those or like pause those. That's not something that like can as easily be pushed to the edges, because it's a discrete event that impacts everybody who's using the system.
Totally. And we are seeing this happening also in the business context, you know, because we, for example, we're working now with this Chinese company called Hire that is using smart contracting at the edge of the organization to generate possibilities for business model innovations. So I think there's a lot of resonance here, a lot of patterns that we are seeing unfolding in many places. So as we head towards the end of the interview, I think I have another couple of points that I would love to explore with you. And one is more focused on the learning. So how do you guys look after this idea that that you sustain and support the ecosystem in the process of learning? So how do you take care of them really becoming the best version of themselves by choosing to be organizers inside the Aragon system instead of being organizers outside of Aragon system?
I'm not sure I totally follow the question.
So how do you support them in if there is anything, any strategy for that, to support them in understanding what they can do, onboarding them, teaching them what to do, helping them learning how to make the best of the system? So the question that I have is, people need to choose to be inside of Aragon ecosystem or outside. So how do you make the case for being inside, especially with a focus on learning and with a focus of expanded opportunities versus staying outside of the Aragon ecosystem?
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, I think that we're all learning, both like internally and externally. Like, this is new technology. We're trying to do new things. And so the most important thing that we can do is to actually like get on the ground and kind of work with people that are trying to explore these concepts and support them and help them be successful. So I've personally, like, I participate in many different like communities and DAOs, both running on Aragon, some that aren't, just so that like I can kind of understand the specific challenges that they're facing, and because they're awesome communities to be a part of, which is cool. And other people on the Aragon One team have also kind of done this, and in a sense, it's sort of dog fooding, but it's dog fooding not just like internally, but also with other people that are trying to apply the technology.
Good. I would say, Stina, Eugenio, if you have anything else to add, or otherwise I would ask maybe Luke just to add something on it. So
I just have one question. I don't know if it's like in terms of frequency, no? Like, let's say that how frequent is the interaction on your platform or platforms, and how long would it take, let's say, for someone to show interest and then like to setting up? Because I mean, your website says in 5 minutes, but I'm a bit of a layman in this conversation, but like I'm just curious to know that, like.
Yeah, I think 5 minutes is it's very specific in terms of like, that's how fast you can deploy the contracts and start interacting. But like, what people are trying to build is not like a technical restriction. It's like building a community, building all of those like human interactions, because like deploying a tool or like setting up a tool is like the tip of the iceberg in terms of like effort and like time. And so like on our website, we can say you can create a DAO in 5 minutes, but when you do that, you're going to be the only member of your DAO and you're going to have all the voting power. And that doesn't really like get you any closer to having like a community or really accomplishing your goal. But it is like a starting point. And so I guess what I would say is that it's very easy to get started. I encourage you to get started. If you set up an org on the test network, it doesn't cost anything. And so you can play around. And there's a handful of different templates kind of available. So you can explore different use cases. What I will say is like getting it installed and interacting with it is very much the easy part. Applying it to a specific ecosystem or platform or community kind of challenge takes a lot more kind of thought and a lot more effort and a lot more time. There's no like easy button for that sort of thing.
And do you see a lot of people getting started and like dropping out, or how is the engagement? Is it like?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the drop-off rate is really, really high because it's relatively cheap and easy to get started in terms of like setting one of these things up. But like I said, the hard part is actually like the human elements and all the other things. So if we like measure people clicking the button to like create one of these things, to actually like succeeding and having like a thriving community and using it on a daily basis, I would say it's a pretty massive drop off, just because it's the hard part that we're not necessarily able to solve for. But what I will say is that like you can, there's a site, apiary.onehive.org, that basically tracks Aragon organizations. So you can see all like 1,400 of them. And there's metrics regarding kind of engagement and activity. And if you sort by that, you can see the organizations that are actively being used on a daily basis. And some of them have like profiles where you can like kind of join the community and kind of see what their operations are. Because the really interesting thing about the organizations that are using this technology is they're completely transparent. So like you can see all of the decisions that are being made, and you can potentially get involved, and you can find where like the community lives, and you can get like a good picture of like the day-to-day operations doing that.
Cool. Thanks.
Eugenio, do you have anything to add? That's a question.
Not really. That was an interesting interview, by the way. No, I don't have anything to add or ask.
Luke, do you want to add something that you think it may be beneficial for us to ponder as we think about how platforms and ecosystem models evolve in the next decade?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I had like followed some of your past work. I think this idea of platform cooperatives and like community-owned enterprises is really, really powerful. I think there's lots of details that we still have to kind of figure out in terms of how both from a technical and like legal and like social layer, we kind of make that possible. But I think that at the end of the day, solving that problem and like enabling like more like grassroots style organization to really create value and kind of compete with the traditional like corporate kind of capitalist model is really, really, really compelling. And so I would say figuring out that intersection between kind of the legal, technical, and social with regard to like empowering kind of platform cooperativism is really useful. And if you guys have specific thoughts on that, how we can help, I would love to learn more.
Well, I guess that to some extent, the work you guys are doing with these enabling modules and systems is really going in that direction. No? So to be able to create more broader and deeper financial artifacts and also and governance artifacts, and not just user experience artifacts, which is, I believe, the key of the transition between traditional corporate capitalistic models. But I would say more than the corporate capitalistic model, I think the problem is also this idea that everything is about just the product, no? And as you have discussed in the call, I think the problem is also about how do we evolve the organization and how do we evolve the products by decentralizing choices, visions, and enabling diversity in the, I would say, in the forces that drive the development of an organization, and not just the monopoly of user experience to drive the organization. Once Joe Pine said that customer experience is an essential dimension of how a company competes. And the question is that probably it doesn't need to be the only dimension, because otherwise we just end up in this race to the bottom that we have seen. So I think we are exploring this, and your work is foundational to that. So thanks very much for your time, Luke, and I'm sure that this will be very useful for many also of our listeners, and thanks again.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Thanks.
See you, bye.